if you can start targeting the muscles like the hip abductor muscles on the side of your hip, the hip rotators and the hamstring muscles, you can protect the knee, you can prevent injuries, and you can essentially improve your performance. Because now as you're running, there's going to be less inefficiencies in your movement, and so you can run faster and basically be less susceptible to injuries and pain.
Hello, and welcome to the June 28th, 2024 edition of the TriDoc Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Sankoff, an emergency physician, triathlete, triathlon coach, and multiple Ironman finisher, coming to you as always from beautiful, sunny Denver, Colorado. Well, for the last 2 years on the TriDoc Podcast, I've had the great pleasure of working with a couple of outstanding interns, but today marks the changing of the guard, a new chapter, turning of the page. Turning over a new leaf, all of the different cliches that you can imagine, they all are true for today. And I wanted, before they go, to have you all have a chance just to meet them and have them say hello to you and tell them a little bit about who they are, because they've been the anonymous faces behind the scenes doing a lot of the hard work that lets this podcast be as good as it is, at least as good as I think it is. I'd like you all to meet, for the first time on the program, Ben Johnson and Ian Johnson, two youthful, wet behind the ears, Grinnell seniors when I first met them. They are now a couple of years out from finishing at Grinnell. And the Grinnell connection continues on this program. Maddie Pesh, who was my first intern, she was a professional triathlete who had gone to Grinnell, and she connected me with Ben and Ian a couple of years ago. And they are moving on and have connected me with two more Grinnell graduates. So Ben, Ian, welcome at long last to the face-fronting part of the TriDoc Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for the welcome. It's good to be here.
Yep, thank you, Jeff.
So Ben, let's start with you. Tell everybody, because I know I had never heard of Grinnell until I met Maddie, and now I feel like I've got this connection with the alumni or something. Tell us about Grinnell. Where is it? How big a school is it? And what got you to go there?
Yeah, Grinnell is it's an interesting place. So it's a small private liberal arts school in the middle of Iowa, in Grinnell, Iowa, actually, about halfway in between Des Moines and Iowa City. It's very small. Total undergraduate population is like 1,600 students. It still draws students from all over the country, though, and from other countries as well. So what really drew me there, I guess, was, well, they gave a great financial aid package to start. That was really nice.
That's important.
Yes, it is. But I also, it was a great place for me to further my athletic career as a swimmer. I enjoyed swimming there. I loved the coach, Aaron Hurley, that we got to work with over our swimming career. And yeah, when I visited, it just seemed like a great place. So.
And what's next for you? What are you looking at doing come, a couple of months away from now?
So in a couple months, I'll be moving to Peoria, Illinois, to go to the University of Illinois College of Medicine. I'll be starting my MD degree.
That's fantastic. And will you be, the big question everybody wants to know, taking up running and biking so that not only can you follow in the footsteps of Maddie and even myself and become a physician, but will you become a triathlete as well?
You know what? I think we've talked about this before, but I do enjoy biking, but running is always a bit of a harder sell for me. I'm not much of a runner. So maybe if we cut that part out of the triathlons, then I'll start doing them. We'll do the biathlons.
And Ian, what was it that got you to Grinnell, and what are you going to be doing going forward?
For me, it was similar to Ben. I went there and toured when I was still in high school, and I found a great dynamic between the coaches and the swimmers at the time. Ben and I are both swimmers right after that. So I knew that I would fit in on the team and could really excel under the leadership there. And apart from that, just generally the educational perspectives and the opportunities there are quite good in terms of especially what I want to do to focus on looking into college. While I studied both biochemistry, as I've been doing a lot of on this podcast, and then economics in college, I'm going on to do something more economics oriented right now, doing some work in category development and sales analytics right now for a retail firm.
Excellent. And when Maddie first approached you, Ian, about doing the TriDoc Podcast, what was it that made you interested in getting involved as an intern?
One of, I suppose, my favorite parts of learning, just in general, is applying what I've been learning. So I went to school for 4 years learning all this biochemistry and glycolysis and metabolism and all these different things. But working as an intern on the TriDoc podcast has kind of given me an opportunity to learn by action and learn how this information and how all these different academic principles can be applied to real field and can really help people. So I was able to turn something that was very academic and very textbook by nature into an active thing that I could do to help people out and to help them learn too.
And are you going to become a triathlete? Or have we co-opted you from the pool at all, or is this just a failure on my part?
So I'm a bit different from Ben. I love running and I love swimming as well. As I started with swimming, I'm a little bit more new in terms of cycling. I'm not the best cyclist in the world, but who knows? Maybe you'll see me on two wheels someday.
Ben, do you have a particular segment that you worked on over the last couple of years that really stands out in your memory as something that you found particularly interesting or really something that kind of resonated with you?
I guess a couple episodes. I don't remember the exact particulars or the numbers or anything, but I feel like a lot of the first things that Ian and I did were working with gut health. And I always thought that was super interesting, just with all the recent research coming out that just gut health kind of impacts everything you do, all your microbiome just impacting your entire body. And that definitely sticks out in my mind.
And Ian, was there any one or a couple of things that you remember working on that really stuck with you?
Ben kind of stole my answer as well. I was also going to bring up the gut microbiome and just learning how much your insides really affect your outsides, right? How the things you eat and just your day-to-day life affect the way that your body works to a fundamental level. But I suppose I would extend that a little bit. We've talked about a number of different nutritional supplements like ginseng and curcumin, especially recently. And I think that's been wonderful and fascinating in terms of learning just how much, or I suppose how little in some cases, small nutritional changes can really make a difference or can affect your endurance athletics in certain ways.
You've stuck it out for 2 years, so I hope the experience has been a good one, Ben. Would you say that this is something you would recommend for others who would maybe think about this in the future?
This experience has definitely been a very good one, Jeff. Yeah, I'm definitely going to miss it. Sometimes when there's a meeting coming up and Ian and I were like, oh my gosh, there's a meeting tomorrow. It's crazy. We have to prepare for it. Sometimes I'm not going to miss that feeling, but definitely after our last meeting, I definitely felt a little sad. I was like, wow, I'm not going to be able to do this again.
And Ian?
Yeah, I think even if not doing it for a specific purpose, like the podcast, just kind of looking into research and going on the National Institute of Health website and figuring out the answers to the things you have questions about and just thinking critically and wondering is really, I think, an important part of my life. And it has definitely bettered me in the way I go about my everyday. So I would absolutely recommend any type of research you're happy about doing.
Well, I cannot thank you both enough. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you both, seeing you grow, Ben, sharing in your acceptance to medical school, and I look forward to watching that process as it unfolds. Just having you guys be here and contribute to the show the way you have has been fantastic, and it's not an exaggeration to say that I could not have done it without you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I will definitely miss the opportunity to insert that little audio clip from Die Hard at the end of the show. And for people who don't listen all the way to the end, I am going to put it in one last time at the end of this segment before the medical mailbag, because I have enjoyed listening to it every single week, because as a Die Hard fan, having two Johnsons who are not related on the show, that was the first thing I thought of when I met them. Anyways, guys, thank you again. Huge kudos to everything you've done. And I know on behalf of all my listeners, we really, really appreciate everything, all the hard work. So thanks and good luck to you both. And thank you for setting us up with two new interns who we will get to meet on the next episode. Ben, Ian, good luck in the future.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
So on the show today, we have the last medical mailbag segment that Ben and Ian were so kind to help with the research on. And why don't you guys, as your last official act, do you want to tell us what the medical mailbag segment is all about?
So a listener sent in a question about the effects of antihistamines on endurance exercise performance. And Ben and I found lots of interesting data as well as some results to help all of you listeners out there to be informed about, especially in terms of when we're getting into allergy season here, what to watch out for.
Juliet and I will be along in just a couple of moments to talk about what we found and what our recommendations are for anybody who might be taking these medications. A little bit later on in the show, I'm going to be joined by Jonathan Su. Jonathan is a physiotherapist who works out of the Bay Area and has written several different books related to helping people improve their fitness, improve their core strength. And he has a recent book that's come out called The 6-Minute Guide to Healing Knee Pain. And he talks to me about how he feels certain kinds of movements can contribute to helping people who have knee pain, regardless of what it's from. And I thought it was a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it as well. Before we get to all of that, though, I want to take my customary moment to thank all of you who have taken the time and have taken the consideration to become a Patreon supporter of this podcast and have decided that for about the cost of a cup of coffee per month, you are willing to help support this podcast and keep it ongoing every couple of weeks or so. For those of you who have not yet joined and are interested in finding out what becoming a Patreon member entails, you can head over to my Patreon site, which is www.patreon.com/TriDocPodcast, where you can see the different levels of support, the different bonus episodes that come out about every month or so that you will have access to if you join. And if you join at the $10 per month level, you could see the very fine BOCO TriDoc Podcast running hat that you will receive as a gift from me to you. Yeah. As always, I want to thank you just for considering becoming a Patreon supporter and thank all of my existing Patreon supporters for your ongoing support. We're going to get going with the medical mailbag, but before we do, here, as promised, is that clip that is in the extra credits for the last couple of years. Thank you again, Ian and Ben, for being a part of the show.
I'm Agent Johnson. This is Special Agent Johnson.
Oh, how you doing?
No relation.
I'm Jeff Sankoff, the TriDoc. I'm in charge here.
Not anymore.
It's time again for the medical mailbag. That means I am joined by my friend and colleague, Juliet Hockman, who is relaxing in the summer glory that is Hood River, a little bit higher, well, not higher, but cooler than it is here in Denver today. How are you doing today, Juliet?
I'm doing great. And yes, summer is here, although we're just mourning the already past milestone of the summer solstice, which means these are already getting shorter, but I still feel like they
palpably shorter.
September.
Palpably shorter.
No,
I'm
I
already
refuse
sad.
to believe it. No.
And our mutual friend Kelly in Australia is rubbing her hands with glee as her days are getting longer.
Anyway, we still have 3 or 4 fine months of outdoor riding ahead of us, so that's a thrill.
Yes, exactly. And I have the bonus of going to Taupo in December, so I'll even get a little fringe summer benefit there. Anyways, on to more pressing matters. We have a question submitted by a listener on the Facebook group for the TriDoc Podcast. What? You aren't a member? You have to listen, and I will tell you at the end of this very exciting medical mailbag how you can become one if you aren't. But one of our members submitted a question. And what was that question for us today, Juliet?
Right. So this athlete has read that taking antihistamines to help for allergies or other discomfort and ailments actually reduces athletic performance or decreases athletic performance. And he is wondering if the TriDoc could go down the rabbit hole on that one and learn a little bit more about it. So I'd be really curious to hear what you and your team found out.
Yeah, so this was a good one. We dug into this and had a lengthy conversation yesterday, actually. And if you heard the intro to the podcast today, you know that this was the last topic for the outgoing interns. Ben and Ian Johnson are moving on to other things and have left the podcast in good hands with our incoming interns, who you will meet on the next episode. But I want to thank again Ben and Ian for all their hard work. We had a really good conversation looking at the papers that they came up with on this. And Daniel Frings is the athlete who submitted this question. He himself was an allergy sufferer and he wanted to know about this. This was not something I had ever heard about. So it was interesting to me, and I love digging into questions that teach me something. The paper that he was referring to is one that came out in 2019 by a researcher by the name of Eli. His name is spelled Ely. He is one of these guys who's clearly made his name in this field because he's published most of the papers on antihistamines. And the name of the paper was Histamine Receptor Antagonists, Low 10-Kilometer Cycling Performance in Competitive Cyclists, which clearly shows that Dr. Eli has gone to the Jeff Sankoff title writing school. He basically said everything that needed to be said in that title. He told you what the study was showing, told you what the study found, all in one short little succinct title, which I love. Now, before we get into the meat of that study, we just have to, I think, take a second to just go over something you alluded to in your paraphrasing of the question, which was that there are different kinds of antihistamines. Histamine is a chemical that is made within the body. It is synthesized by an enzyme called histidine decarboxylase, which is probably more than you need to know, but there it is anyways. And there are different kinds of histamine receptors. Principally, there are two that are really important. There's the H1 histamine receptor, which is responsible for causing all of our allergy symptoms, so runny nose, sneezing, cough, wheeziness, if you are so susceptible. And then there's the H2 receptors, which are found principally in the stomach. And when the H2 receptor is stimulated, it causes secretion of acid into the stomach. So antihistamines that block the H1 receptor are medications that will block allergy symptoms. H2 blockers are medications like Pepcid, which is a trade name, but it's a medication that is pretty ubiquitously found in North America with or without a prescription and is used to decrease acid secretion in the GI tract and can go a long way towards relieving heartburn and gastroesophageal reflux symptoms, those kinds of things. Whatever the case, this particular study looked at blockers of both receptors, so a combined H1, H2 receptors. And the purpose of this study was to gain insight into the role of histamine, the the transmitter that acts on these receptors in endurance exercise in humans, and see whether or not there is an effect, because there have been animal studies that suggest that histamine does have some impact on performance. So we're going to talk about one of those animal studies in a second. And then there's been human studies that have not really showed the same kinds of results. And in a lot of animal studies, what they found is that histamine concentrations increase in active muscles during moderate intensity endurance exercise, but it's not clear why. It's not clear what exactly histamine is doing. It's not clear what blocking histamine is going to do. And so they don't really understand what the role is for histamine. And that's why there is this question of whether or not it is going to have an impact on exercise. So this is a pretty small study, 11 cyclists, most of which were male. There were 3 females. They were all competitive cyclists. So these were all young, very high-performing cyclists. And they were randomized to one of 2 groups that either got antihistamines or they got placebo. They then went through a couple of different test protocols. I'm not going to go into all of it, but basically they did 10-kilometer time trials. They did sprint tests. They went through a variety of conditions, whether or not they were rested or non-rested. I'm just going to cut to the chase here, and I'm just going to read right from the paper. The main finding of the present investigation was that taking combined H1 and H2 histamine receptor antagonists, so taking an H1 and H2 histamine blocker, slowed time to completion of a 10-kilometer time trial in competitive cyclists by about 11 seconds. Doesn't sound like a huge amount, but it was statistically significant, and the percentage of that they actually found was similar to the kinds of performance-enhancing effects that you would see with altitude training or caffeine. So they were basically saying that these histamine-blocking medications reduced performance to the same magnitude that caffeine or altitude training can improve performance. So 10 seconds or 11 seconds over 10 kilometers doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about it that way, it's pretty significant. So they therefore feel that histamine has a clear role in how skeletal muscle performs during these kinds of endurance performance, but they don't, in this paper at least, understand how it works or what it actually does to block these receptors. So kind of an interesting study. And really the only one that we found that looked specifically at this question of humans doing endurance performance and whether or not giving them histamine blockers did anything. We did find another study in animals. I mentioned in the first study that there was this question of, hey, animal studies show one thing, human studies show another. Well, here's a mouse model. Yes, another mouse model.
Oh, poor swimming, drowning.
I know
mice.
this one's not swimming. This one has them on treadmills, little mouse treadmills. I wonder if they've just moved the treadmills around from study to study. This one has the mouse treadmill, but they had them like walking to exhaustion for like 5 hours. I mean, it sounds awful again.
How
But
do you
anyways,
make a mouse walk to exhaustion?
they don't let them off. They just keep the treadmill moving and they have to keep walking or else they slide off.
It's a cage treadmill. It's a cage
exactly.
treadmill.
Yeah. So this paper's from 2012. It's titled "Roles of Histamine in Exercise-Induced Fatigue, Favoring Endurance and Protecting Against Exhaustion," suggesting that histamine improves endurance and protects against fatigue. Basically, again, as I said, a mouse study where they compared normal mice, and then used a variety of different ways of blocking histamine receptors. Sometimes they gave them antihistamines. Sometimes they actually used genetically modified mice that had a lack of that enzyme that's required to convert histidine to histamine, which is super interesting. And then again, as I said, they had these mice walking on the treadmill. And broadly, the researchers found that injection of a histamine receptor or knocking out the necessary components needed to create histamine or a deficiency in histamine receptors all resulted in the same thing. Essentially, mice couldn't do as well as if they had normal amounts of histamine and normal amounts of histamine receptors. So we have two papers here that show that antihistamines appear to impact exercise performance, but at this point, we don't have a sense of why or what's going on, which to me is really, really interesting because usually you have a theory first, right? Usually people will say, hey, I have this drug, an antihistamine, and I know it does XYZ. And so I think XYZ is involved in exercise. And so this is why I think it's going to have an impact. And they don't start from that. They're actually finding that antihistamines affect exercise. And now they're having to come up with some kind of theory, which is super interesting.
But
so
more
we found a paper.
More importantly, there's no either or, right? I mean, if you are an athlete who suffers from horrible seasonal allergies and your eyes water and you can't breathe through your nose and your chest is congested and all these things, and you can't go out and perform your training properly or race properly because you're not taking antihistamines, is it still better not to take antihistamines than to take antihistamines? So we don't have the better with or better without comparison.
Yeah, and you're summing. I mean, that's the punchline, right? I mean, that's going to end up being where we're left at the end of all of this because we can look at these papers in isolation, but you are bringing up the most important point, which is, it's fine to say that these medications have an effect, but what about the effect that these medications are treating? I think that's the question that we don't have an answer to. And unfortunately, for some reason, nobody's done that study. In the paper where they gave cyclists antihistamines, they were all healthy. None of them were allergy sufferers. So it's interesting. It seems to me if you gave people a variety of different medications, you would probably find that many of them cause some kind of impact on performance. The question really needs to be, well, okay, so let's say an antihypertensive medication, right? I mean, if you give beta blockers to people, you know that they're going to have an impact on performance. But the question is well, is it better that they have their high blood pressure and they have their other problems? Probably not. And as you are very astutely and rightly saying, that's the question here. And we don't have that answer. As I think we'll get to, let's just go through these other papers because they are interesting. Because they do kind of raise, I think, some arguments that would make that question something we could kind of get our teeth into, but unfortunately, without a good study, it's hard to. But here's a paper from 2017, the intriguing role of histamine in exercise responses. And basically, this was a study in which they acknowledged the fact that, look, there's all these papers out there that show that histamine seems to have a role in how muscle works, but we don't know how. So here are our theories. And they listed 4 different possible ways that histamine could affect exercise performance. And the first is that we know that aerobic exercise results in activation in both the H1 and H2 receptors within exercise muscle. And so there's been some evidence that histamine can affect vasodilation, or the dilation of blood vessels in those muscles, that is mediated by the histamine receptor. So is it possible, by blocking histamine, are you restricting blood flow? And is that therefore impacting exercise performance? So that's an interesting theory. And in fact, there's a paper that looks at that. So we'll get to that in a second. Second one, histamines drive the availability of glucose to skeletal muscle. And if you block the histamine receptors, you could diminish glycogen stores and impair exercise performance. And that was actually something that the authors of that mouse study were suggesting was the cause. But again, no experimental data has been found that actually shows this to be true or the case. It's all theoretical. Third is histamines regulate inflammation and pain sensitivity. Therefore, it's possible that antihistamines can decrease muscle soreness and reduce pain perception. However, they potentially slow immune cell migration in the process. So kind of a double-edged sword here, where we think that antihistamines can improve maybe delayed onset muscle soreness, maybe muscle soreness related to hard efforts, but you're slowing immune cell migration into the area, and therefore you may prolong the healing and the improvement and adaptation of muscle after a hard effort. I have one other paper that we're going to look at that talks about that. And then the last theoretical reason rationale that they come up with for why antihistamines might affect exercise is that histamine modify more than 25% of genes related to exercise. So that's pretty interesting. And so they theorize that blocking histamines may have some impact on how gene expression is taking place in exercising muscle. Okay, so the first of those things I talked about was blood flow in exercising muscle. And there's a paper that looked at the effect of histamine receptor antagonism on leg blood flow during exercise. This is by our champion author, Eli. This was done in 2020. And I'm not even going to bother with the entirety of the study. I'll just sum up what they found, which is this study found that contrary to what we would have expected, antihistamines actually increased blood flow during exercise to working muscle, didn't decrease blood flow. So that theory that was posited, that antihistamines might impact exercise performance by restricting blood flow, that one is now off the table because it turns out that's not true. Another study that I talked about, or another study that I said looked at one of these other theories, effective histamine receptor antagonism on the circulating inflammatory cell and cytokine response to exercise, a pilot study, once again by Eli. This one just out earlier this year. And this paper showed very eloquently that antihistamines do in fact impact the way circulating inflammatory cells migrate to muscle that's been damaged in hard efforts. But the clinical meaning of this is completely unclear. This was a very kind of experimental cell-based level sort of study. What they showed was, as we've talked about in the past, when we exercise, we do damage to our muscle cells, and that causes an inflammatory response. And inflammatory cells need to get into those muscles in order to heal those muscle cells, make them stronger, and that overall is a form of adaptation to allow you to be stronger and exercise better later on. Antihistamines, it turns out, seem to impact that migration of inflammatory cells to where they're needed. But what does that mean? I don't know, because it doesn't explain why you would have a problem exercising at the time. It explains maybe why you wouldn't adapt as well,
Right.
but it doesn't really explain to me why you wouldn't why you would have an issue with performance. So
Yeah.
it's interesting, but I don't know that answers our question. And so at the end of all of this, we're left exactly with the most important question, which is what you brought up. And my N of 1 is, again, I talk about him a lot. He's one of my favorite people in the world, and that's my son, Adam, who's running every day now as he preps for his cross-country season, and he suffers from allergies, and he takes an antihistamine. And we were just talking about this today. I mentioned to him that we were going to be talking about this for the medical mailbag, and And he said, well, I really need them to clear out my nose so I could breathe better. And if I can't breathe through my nose, I notice I get side stitches. I notice it's harder for me to breathe and run as well. So like you said, is it better to take these medications and have your symptoms controlled, or is it better to not take them, deal with the symptoms? Because we would need to see that study, right? We would need to take 100 different people who suffer from allergies. We would need to quantify their symptoms so that we know that we're comparing apples to apples. And we would need to give them, we would have to do a crossover study where we'd have to give them antihistamines on one day, randomized antihistamines and placebo, antihistamines on one day, have them do their exercise. And then on another day, give them placebo, have them do their exercise. And that way you would be comparing them to both each other, but also to themselves, and see whether or not their allergies or their antihistamines were worse. And I'm not a huge allergy sufferer, but I mean, I see how Adam is, and I see how other people are. And my guess would be probably the antihistamines would do a better job for them.
Well, I also think we need to understand better, given the two categories that you roughly laid out of his antihistamines, if one is quote unquote worse than the other in terms of impacting athletic performance, because there's a lot on the market, right? And so at the end of the day, we want to know, is it okay to take Claritin but not Benadryl, or is it okay? I mean, what's the best antihistamine?
Well, it's a valid point. It's a valid point, but I will say that, Claritin, Benadryl, all of those medications, they have somewhat different mechanisms, but the end result is they block the histamine receptor. Benadryl causes a lot more fatigue because it works centrally. It affects the H3 receptor, which I haven't talked about. But the Claritin tends to be much more specific to the H1. But you are right, because is there a difference if you're blocking just the H1 versus just the H2 versus a combination effect across all three receptors? That's something that hasn't been answered here, and I think that would be very interesting and helpful. And again, the bigger question, this is all super interesting. It's all very kind of in the weeds. It's getting to this idea that I've talked about in the past, which is we have disease-oriented outcomes and we have patient-oriented outcomes. And these are both, in a little bit of a way, they're both disease and patient. But the thing is, it's not taking into account the fact that this medication has a beneficial effect for a lot of people. And what we want to know is that beneficial effect enough to outweigh this small negative effect that it's having on performance? Now, I don't know what Daniel's, the listener who submitted the question, I don't know how bad his allergy symptoms are, but if his allergy symptoms are bad enough that he's taking an antihistamine, I'm going to guess that they're more than just a nuisance. And I mean, it's not for me to advise anybody here because these are over-the-counter medications. You have to make a decision for yourself. But I would say, if you're having symptoms enough that taking an antihistamine is something you feel you need to do in order to get through the day comfortably, I wouldn't be too troubled by this small finding, at least for now, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would be my take on this. Do you suffer from allergies much?
I do. I mean, it's sort of seasonal a little bit, and it just kind of comes and goes. I've never had it identified because it's never been worth it to me. But I do, at particular times of the year, get very itchy skin. And I know that Claritin, for example, can help alleviate that discomfort when it comes on. Could I live without it? Sure. Do I think it impacts my performance? No, it's inconvenient and lasts, a few minutes before I break a clear sweat. So it's not the same as I can't get enough oxygen in to perform the set that I need to perform. But it is nice to know that it helps, for sure. So I'd be curious to know if we ever have the opportunity to have the results of, a study that would really speak clearly to athletes about choices.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll keep monitoring it, and we will see if anything pops up in the future about this. And I might just drop a note to Dr. Ellie or Eli and ask that question, because I think it's a question that really needs to be answered. Because while the questions that he has answered are really interesting, they strike me as purely academic. And
I was going to say,
for me as a
it's
coach,
not applicable. Yeah, it's not applicable.
Yeah, for me as a coach, and certainly for anybody who out there is an allergy sufferer, that's what they want to know. Is they want to know what we've been talking about, and that's now the more that I think about it, now that I've said it out loud, I'm going to write him a note. I'm just going to
That's
make
awesome.
that
Well, there's
suggestion.
also so many
Yeah.
interesting ways to parse the study too. I mean, men, women, different age groups, different energy zones, different types of allergies, different types of histamines. I mean, you could do a lot of work on this, a lot of studies. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
This has been another really interesting topic and a great subject for the medical mailbag. And we couldn't do it, of course, without our listeners like Daniel, who submitted this on the Facebook group that is there for you to join. I mentioned earlier that I would get to that. So if you aren't a member and would like to become one, please search Facebook for the TriDoc podcast. Answer the 3 very easy questions. I will gain you admittance. You can join the conversation and submit your questions. Alternatively, you can always send me an email, tri_doc@icloud.com. You can ask your question that way. You can just give me feedback on how you're enjoying the program, how much you like the medical mailbag, or potentially if you don't, if you have suggestions to make it better, I'm always interested in hearing those as well. For now, that's another episode done. And Juliet, I wish you the best and look forward to seeing you in a very short time now. We are in the countdown for Oregon. We are, we're about a month away. So
I know.
looking
Can't
forward
wait.
to,
It's going to be so much fun. And we get to play for 36 hours afterwards as well, which is
exactly.
better.
Yeah, it's going to be great. All right. Well, until next time, Juliet, thanks for being here. And we'll see you again for the next episode.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Just a quick note to say that I did send a note to Dr. Eli and his lab. They told me that, as far as they know, no studies have been done looking at antihistamines in allergy sufferers and seeing whether or not the use of antihistamines versus not using antihistamines is beneficial. In other words, allergy sufferers, I think you can continue to use these medications if they're giving you benefit. If I find anything that comes out in the future, I'll let you know. My guest on the podcast today has a doctorate in physiotherapy. Dr. Jonathan Su works as a physical therapist. He's also a yoga therapist and fitness coach and is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. His clients include entrepreneurs, executives, and elite athletes. He's a former U.S. Army officer, and he was the officer in charge of injury prevention, rehabilitation, and performance optimization for the 25th Infantry Division. Dr. Su is a co-author of the clinical textbook Netter's Orthopedic Clinical Examination and the author of 6-Minute Fitness at 60 Plus and 6-Minute Core Strength. He serves as a fitness panel expert for Bottom Line Personal, the most widely circulated consumer newsletter in the United States. A few weeks ago, Dr. Su reached out to me to share his latest book, The 6-Minute Knee Pain Cure, and after reading it, I wanted to have him on to discuss it. Dr. Su, Jonathan, welcome to the TriDoc podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
So I always get a little bit kind of wary when I see the title of some of these self-help books, when they're like, oh, the 5-minute this or the 5-minute that. I certainly understand the reason to market that way. Most people want a quick fix. Why do you think that people can dedicate a short amount of time to problems that have really bogged them down for a long period?
Yeah, I think it's important to have solutions for people that they can apply and easily apply. I think one of the biggest challenges in healthcare and with injury prevention is that if the solution is too complex or it takes too long, a lot of people won't actually execute it in the way that they should.
Now, this audience, triathletes, they're used to putting in the work necessary to get to where they're trying to go. So help triathlete, someone who's used to training hours on end, help them understand why 6 minutes is all that is needed to deal with some of these things, because we're constantly succumbing to some kind of overuse injuries, something that puts us on the back burner, and we know how frustrating it is. So how do you make the argument that 6 minutes is all you need per day to get yourself over some of these long-term injuries?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the key is to really drill down to exactly what is needed for the particular athlete. And so I imagine with triathletes, a lot of the injuries can stem from running, having to run a marathon for a triathlete event. That's a lot of pounding on the knees. And so if we can just drill down to to tuning up parts of the body involved in running that isn't typically addressed, then the solution can be pretty quick. And especially if you implement a way of doing it where you're targeting the muscles specific to running.
Now, what I liked about your book was that it's not so much diagnosis specific, and I'm referring here to the knee pain cure. We know that knee pain is a very common affliction, especially among older, more sedentary populations. But as I've already mentioned, amongst triathletes, knee issues are very, very common. It's almost always overuse. One of the things that I thought was interesting in your book is that you don't ever really discuss specific injuries or specific causes of knee pain. Your philosophy seems to be that it doesn't matter what's causing your pain. I can fix it based on understanding that no matter what the cause of your pain is, it's probably due to a few of these basic kind of root elements. Can you give me a sense of where you came up or how you came up with that notion?
When I was an Army officer, I worked a lot with soldiers who had to put on 50, 60 pounds of gear and now all of a sudden pretty much jog 12 or more miles. And what I saw was the same issues popping up over and over again. I mean, these were young, healthy athletes, and they were suffering from knee pain. And that was one of the biggest issues that popped up. And so what I figured out was that if you can start targeting the muscles like the hip abductor muscles on the side of your hip, the hip rotators that are also located on the side of the hip, and the hamstring muscles, you can protect the knee, you can prevent injuries, and you can essentially improve your performance. Because now as you're running, what's going to happen is that there's going to be less inefficiencies in your movement, and so you can run faster and basically be less susceptible to injuries and pain.
Now, do you believe that your routine that you've developed here, do you believe that this is something that people can do who don't have knee pain in order to prevent it from happening? Or are people who are not suffering from any kind of knee injuries, do they need to do anything or just keep doing what they're doing?
Oh, absolutely. I believe that if you are, especially if you're a triathlete, especially if you're a runner, you need to be doing these things. Because one of the things that's not part of our awareness level yet is that we need to have a tune-up program for our bodies. We understand that we need to go see the dentist once or twice a year for maintenance work, but we haven't really sort of applied that sort of thinking to the human body. If you have no pain at all, by doing these types of simple exercises that tunes up your muscles that are involved in walking and running and hiking, you're going to be able to prevent injuries.
My sense in reading your book is that you feel that the vast majority of knee overuse injuries, and it seems like that's really what we're talking about. I mean, we should be clear that your book is not meant to help people who have a torn ACL or have a bucket handle tear of their meniscus. Your book is really meant for people who have chronic knee pain, predominantly from overuse injuries. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I say so. And I mean, to add to that, if you have had a meniscus injury or surgery or ACL tear and you've had it treated and that injury has healed and resolved, you might be having chronic knee pain down the road because of all the changes that have happened because of the injury. And so the types of things you need to do for that knee are similar to the types of things you need to do for a general tune-up program for your knee.
Right. The architecture of the knee has been changed, and so you are now putting new forces on the knee, and that is leading to potentially chronic pain down the road. But to be clear, this is not for... Your program is not so much for people who have acute or even chronic structural issues. It's really more for people who have overused stuff that can be related to structural, as we just said, with an ACL reconstruction. But for the most part, if you're dealing with chronic knee pain due to rheumatoid arthritis, for example, this is not going to make that pain go away. But however, if you're dealing with knee pain because you've been running for a long time and you just can't shake your jumper's knee or you can't shake your chondromalacia, this kind of program is something that might work for you. So Jonathan, let's talk about the three phases or the three important points that you kind of bring to bear in this program of yours. And the first of these is you talk about restoring alignment. Can you give a sense of what you mean by that?
If you're doing a lot of running, walking, hiking, what happens is that with every mile that you walk, that's about 2,000 steps total. So you can imagine that if you're running 25 miles, how many steps that is, and especially if you calculate how many steps you have to take over a year or two of training, it adds up. And so any sort of micro misalignment that can happen with each step can build up. And so with the first step here, which is restore alignment, I find that there's two types of alignment that's usually off in people who do a lot of physical activity. And the first one is side-to-side alignment, and that has to do with your hip abductor muscles and your hip rotator muscles. These muscles are really important because what they do is they help your knee prevent this inward collapse, this valgus motion that can cause pain on the inner sides of your knee. And that's very common in a lot of people, especially women, because in general, the angle of the way that their femur comes down is a little more exaggerated than in men.
And again, we're not talking about alignment here that can be grossly abnormal just by looking at someone. We're not talking about knock knees. We're not talking about rickets where the knees are clearly bent outwards. We're talking about people who otherwise look very normal, but because they have weakness in these hip abductors and these hip rotators, which is very, very common, every time that they take a step, they're having this resulting kind of inward collapse. And again, it sounds more dramatic than it is. It doesn't have to be. When you're stepping 2,000 times per mile, if you have even a millimeter of give inwardly on your knee, over time, that micro trauma will start to have effects, and that can result in chronic knee pain and an overuse type injury. So what Jonathan is talking about in restoring alignment is strengthening those hip abductors, strengthening those hip rotators so that that inward collapse isn't going to happen. You're not going to get that micro trauma, and you're going to relieve the source of that pain. You have a second step here, which is rebalancing strength. So how does that differ from restoring alignment?
What a lot of people believe is that, hey, look, I'm running, I'm walking. That's going to help me build the strength I need of my anti-gravity muscles, mainly the calves, the quadriceps, and the glutes. The challenge with that is that when you're running, you're not actually working those muscles through its full range of motion. So the muscles aren't really building in a way that's going to provide you with the anti-gravity strength that you need. And so with what restoring alignment does is it allows you to work those muscles through its full range, and it builds up the resilience of those muscles so that you could take those thousands of steps without fatigue. And once our body starts to fatigue, our posture, our form starts to slowly deteriorate. So we're just trying to prevent that from happening.
And the rebalancing of strength, I kind of always think of that as when you do a specific activity like running. If you run on flat ground, for example, you tend to over-exaggerate the use of certain muscles. So, for example, your quads can become really, really strong. And if your hamstrings lag behind, then you have this tension, right, between the flexors and the extensors. And that also puts some strain on the knee joint. Is that sort of a easy or accurate way of representing what we're talking about here?
The hamstrings are really an important muscle when it comes to running, mainly because every time you land, your quadricep muscles, they have to contract to keep you upright. And what happens over, like you said, over thousands and thousands of steps is that the quadricep muscles become overworked, and the hamstring muscles on the back of the thigh now are out of balance. Now, why are these hamstrings muscles important? The reason is because if you have the muscles on the front, the quadriceps pulling too much, that's going to cause some joint issues. And so you need the hamstrings on the back to balance things out.
All right. And the third step in your program is release excess tension, which I had a little bit of a hard time getting my head wrapped around. Reading the exercises you talk about is somewhat helpful, but why don't you tell us where is the tension that people have that can cause knee problems, and why do we need to release it?
So, for example, the quadricep muscles can can have some increased tension, and now that pulls on your patellar tendon, and now you can have anterior knee pain as a result of that.
Okay, so let's go through the different steps and how it is that you can get all of this into 6 minutes. So what are people doing for the first step? What kind of exercises do you have them doing to help restore alignment? With the understanding that it's going to be different for everybody. Having read the book, I understand that there are different exercises that people have to figure out which exercise is best for them. But give us an example of one exercise that someone would do to help them restore alignment.
One of the important exercises for step 1 for restoring alignment is the hamstring bridge. So you would lay flat on your back. You would bend your knees, hips and knees to a 90-degree angle with the back of your one heel on top of a workout bench or a chair. And from there, you would just simply bridge up. And what that exercise does is it targets your hamstring muscle. So if you're experiencing anterior knee pain in the front of your knee, just by doing this exercise for 2 minutes, you will most likely notice a decrease in that anterior knee pain immediately.
Now, if an athlete is experiencing pain, chronic pain in their right knee, should they be exercising the left side as well, or do they need to really just focus on the knee that's injured?
I think in the beginning, just focusing on the knee that's injured will be the most productive way to approach it. Down the road, once everything feels good, then you can start incorporating the opposite knee. What I find is that just having more focus in the beginning is important.
And do you tell people to refrain from the activity that got them into trouble? So if this is a runner, would you have them cease running until they're pain-free from doing these exercises?
That's a good question. I think it depends on where they are in their training cycle. So if they're on an off season, then absolutely. But if you're working up towards a race that's coming up, then I don't think it's necessary to stop training.
Okay, let's look at the second step, which is rebalancing strength. So we talked about the hamstring bridge. That would be something that someone does, again, to strengthen those hip abductors, hip rotators. This is all working on the hip area, hamstring as well, to try and restore alignment of the knee joint. What about rebalancing strength?
This step is important, especially if an athlete had an injury, because during the injury, you may be walking on that leg differently, the injured leg. And so what you'll notice when you start working the individual muscles is that the side with the injury is going to be slightly weaker than the opposite side. Now, in the research literature, they call this sidedness, and there's been a lot of research recently showing that this sort of difference, side-to-side difference, even as small as 5 to 10%, can increase the injury rates and also decrease your performance. So you really want to make both sides equal in strength. And so one great exercise is simply just doing a static squat. So meaning you're in a squat position on one leg and just holding that to allow the quadricep and the glute muscles to really work.
So an isometric exercise.
Yes.
Okay. And then for step 3, what are people doing to release excess tension?
For step 3, I mean, most people are familiar with mobility exercises. What I've added that I think most people may not have done is a 3-step process. And I found from working with thousands of soldiers that there's a certain sequence that works better. And I think there's also been some studies to show that, which is you want to first roll the muscle. And so you could use a foam roller, you could use a rolling pin, you could use a tiger tail. You roll out, for example, the quadricep muscles for about 30 seconds. And that starts to get some of those knots released. But then the second step, which is really important that I think a lot of people miss, is that you want to start shaking that muscle. You create some vibration in that muscle. And what that does is it reminds the brain, it cues the brain to say, hey, look, there's something going on in this muscle. Let's pay attention to it. And so you get any sort of like brain-related tension that's causing tension in the muscles to release. And only after that do you stretch the muscle. So I call this the roll, shake, stretch technique. And each step only takes about 30 seconds.
Okay. Now, all of this together, given the name of the book, should take about 6 minutes. And you have people doing this anywhere from once to about 3 times a day, depending on where they're at in their journey. Have you studied this formally in any way, or have you just sort of anecdotally looked at your own patients to see how it's performed?
The process that I laid out in the book is just from just the last 15 years working with thousands of patients. And of course, a lot of it is based on research, but some of it is also based on practical experience that you can't find in the research.
Given your own anecdotal experience, what kinds of results are you seeing from this? I mean, it's always hard for me to accept 100%, so I'm not going to accept that. But let's say, I mean, if you have 100 patients who come to you with chronic knee pain and they do this, what can people expect?
The material for this book comes from my own knee injury that I suffered nearly 30 years ago. So I tore just about every ligament in my knee. I still have one ligament missing, and I was told by an orthopedic surgeon that I would need a knee replacement by my mid-30s. I'm approaching my mid-40s now, and I have no knee pain. I could run. I can do physical activity with no problems. And so a lot of what went into this book was from my own experience, trying to figure out my own knee pain, and then applying this knowledge on thousands of soldiers and civilian patients over the years. So someone with knee pain, and say, like you say, 100 patients come in with knee pain, not because of an acute injury, or they have had an acute injury, but that has passed and is like maybe 8 weeks down the road. I would say 90% of people will notice a 30% difference in 10 days.
That's pretty significant. So that's a good result. And from putting in a pretty brief amount of time, pretty small investment of time, doing exercises that make a lot of sense intuitively. I have been a longtime proponent of incorporating strength training into triathlon training, and all of the listeners of this program are well aware it comes up frequently. And many of the things that you've been talking about are embodied in the programs that I use with my own athletes, strengthening the small supporting muscles, doing a lot of exercises that really emphasize proprioception and balance, because strengthening the muscles that help stabilize all of the joints through the lower chain can go a long way to improving alignment, improving balance and strength, and can do a lot to prevent these kinds of problems from cropping up. But once they have cropped up, I think that this is a program that makes a lot of sense to me. It's certainly something that I would consider for myself or for someone else who I know who might have an injury like this. Not a lot of risk in trying it, that's to be sure. I think the one caveat I would give is, you've mentioned it as well, is this is not for an acute injury. This is for more of an overuse thing. This is more of something that has come about as a result of an acute injury down the road. But this is not for someone who went out and twisted their knee and has swelling in their knee. This is not appropriate. And if you have structural damage from a ski injury or from a running injury or whatever, and you have a known ligamentous instability, you definitely want to speak to an orthopedic surgeon just to determine whether or not you need some kind of surgical repair, because that may be something that is necessary, because all the strengthening in the world is not going to completely fix an inherently unstable joint. Those ligaments are there for a reason. I think that, Jonathan, you would say yourself, your experience as somebody who had a really, really devastating knee injury to not have to have surgery is not necessarily the norm. You've been very fortunate. Clearly something with your anatomy, your constitution has enabled you to go without having had surgery, but that's not going to be normal for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. If you have a serious injury, you do want to seek medical professional help for that before proceeding.
Yeah. All the same, though, I think this is a super interesting kind of program. I think it's, as I said, as a coach, I'm very familiar with my athletes developing some kind of knee issues. My own children are active athletes, and they're at that age in adolescence where knee problems are very, very common, and it invariably comes about because of imbalances in strength and alignment that has to do with the fact that they're growing and they haven't got the muscular support yet for their skeleton. Well, Jonathan, I can't thank you enough for coming to talk to me about all of these different books that you've written. I think it's really a great service that you're doing to help people get a grasp on some really small things that they can do that can have big impact. And I think that this book about the knee pain is a particular interest to my audience, and that's why I wanted to have you talk about it here today. Dr. Jonathan Su is a physical therapist. He's a yoga therapist and fitness coach. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he has come on here today to talk about the 6-minute knee pain cure. I'm going to have links for where you can find the book if you're interested, as well as where you can find more information about Jonathan in the show notes today. Jonathan, thank you again for joining me here on the TriDoc podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Jeff.
And that's it for another episode. The TriDoc podcast is produced and edited by me, Jeff Sankoff, along with my interns.
I'm Agent Johnson. This is Special Agent Johnson.
Oh, how you doing?
No relation.
I'm Jeff Sankoff, the TriDoc. I'm in charge here.
Not anymore.
Those interns are Ian Johnson and Ben Johnson. You can find the show notes for everything discussed on the show today, as well as archives of previous episodes at tridocpodcast.com. Do you have questions about any of the issues discussed on this episode, or do you have a question that you'd like for me to consider answering on a future episode? Send me an email at tri_doc@icloud.com, or join the private TriDoc Podcast Facebook group on Facebook, and you can submit your questions there. If you're interested in coaching services, please visit tridoccoaching.com or lifesportcoaching.com, where you can find a lot of information about me and the services that I provide. You can also follow me on the TriDoc Podcast Facebook page, TriDoc Coaching on Instagram, and the TriDoc Coaching YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope that you'll consider leaving me a rating and a review, as well as subscribe to the show wherever you download it. And of course, there's always the option of becoming a supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/TriDoc Podcast. The music heard at the beginning and the end of the show is Radio by Empty Hours and is used with permission. This song and many others like it can be found at ReverbNation.com, where I hope that you'll visit and give small independent bands a chance. The TriDoc Podcast will be back again soon with another medical question for me to answer and another interview with someone in the world of multisport. Until then, remember 1121 and train hard, train healthy.